Okay, so I'm starting this video tonight about how to become a sound engineer, how to mix music in a church setting, especially a live sound setting, and also if you want to record and mix at home in a home studio environment, that'll be discussed also. So, with that said, this should be one of a couple of videos, maybe 3 or 4, I'm not sure yet. But let's get a start here. Now, if someone comes to me at church and says, I'd like to help you with the soundboard or learn how to do it, I usually start off with some basic questions. The first one is really very basic, and you might think it's silly, but it actually applies. And that would be, do you like music? And surprisingly, there are plenty of people who don't really particularly care. Some people just listen to talk radio or what have you, and music just isn't a big part of their life. And certainly in church, I've heard a lot of people say, I don't care for the music, I just want to hear the sermon, and so on. Obviously, that person would probably not be a very good mixing engineer. So that would tell you what you need to know right off the bat. But assuming the person says, yes, they do like music, then you can continue and ask a few more probing questions to try to figure out how they actually regard it. First thing would be, well, what kind of music do you like? And they might pick a genre, rock and roll, country, gospel, opera, classical, whatever. That's not important, really, because I just want to know that they have an interest. I don't care what it is. Then I would say, all right, so let's say they pick country music. I would say, all right, well, what song stands out to you? What do you like? And they'll name some song. And then I'll say, okay, well, what do you like about it? What is it that gets your attention? Why do you like the song? Now, what I'm looking to get from them is a detailed answer. I want to know that when they listen to music, they actually pay attention and listen to all the musical elements and so on and get some interest out of that. I'm not saying that when the average person listens to music that they need to do that, but I am saying that if you're going to mix audio, you need to be that way. You need to pay attention to what's going on. So, with that question asked, I'm going to hope that they're going to say, well, on this song I especially like the drums, for instance. I like the crack of the snare drum. I like the way the kick drum has a certain thump to it. It drives the song. Or maybe they like the guitar. Maybe it's a traditional country song with a pedal steel guitar or whatever, and they'll say they like the sound of that. And I'll say, okay, now I'm starting to see where you're coming from. Next thing after that would be, I say, all right, well, what do you listen to your music on? Do you have a stereo system or at least a good set of headphones, or what do you do? And again, I'm looking for them to tell me that, well, maybe I use my phone as my main source of music, but I do have a good set of headphones attached to it so I can enjoy what I'm hearing. And I'll say, okay, what headphones do you have? I'm pretty familiar with headphones, so I'll probably know the make and model that they're using, and that'll tell me something. If they're considered a good, accurate set of headphones, that'll be a real plus, because then they'll be listening on a good system right off the bat. But even if not, at least if they have an interest in what things sound like, that's mostly what I'm interested in. The other things like your playback system can be addressed later, and that's fine. Once we get there, I think we have a pretty good candidate. Then, the basic questions, well, when are you available, and so on and so forth. You ask them and address them as needed. But that, I think, is one of the most important requirements or requisite for a sound engineer or whatever name you want to call this. I don't care if you call me the sound man, the sound engineer, or whatever, the sound guy. Great, I don't care. But that's the point. So, with that, let's delve into a little more detail and let's listen to some music that is interesting to my ears and probably would be to most sound guys' ears, because it has some details, these songs, that are worth listening to, that draw your attention. And I will pull that up right now. Okay, this first song is a live recording of Jeff Beck. And what I especially like about the song is the sound of the snare drum, believe it or not. That's not to say there's not other things that are cool about the song, but the snare drum, this is a great example of what I look for if the song that I'm mixing is in this general style. I want my snare drum to sound like this. And here we go. Now you can tell right off the bat that that snare drum has a pretty unusual reverb on it. The technical name for that is called gated reverb. What does that mean? Well, basically the sound effect sounds like what you hear. It's a blast of reverb on the snare drum hit, and then it abruptly stops. Typically a reverb, when you hear reverb on a vocalist, the end of the phrase, when they stop singing, you'll hear what they sang trail off into the distance. But this is not trailing off. This is just one big blast, and it never gets a chance to trail off. It just stops. And it makes that snare drum sound very large, and also makes it sound like you're in an arena. So, with that said, the kick drum also sounds very impressive in this song too. You can play it back if you want. And the next thing that's coming up is just the overall guitar sound. If you're listening in stereo, which if you're not, do get a set of headphones and listen in stereo, and pay attention to the width of the sound. When the guitars kick in, they're very wide sounding. Again, that's a trick that sound guys use a lot of times to make a guitar sound bigger. We always want things to sound bigger and more impressive, and that's what you're going to hear right now coming up. Wait for the power chords. All right. So you get the idea there on Jeff Beck. Now here's another song, completely different genre. This is Bruno Mars. This song I like in particular just for the overall production sound. The sound of it is just plain fabulous. I'll say this more than one time about various songs, but every instrument has its place. Every instrument is noticeable and heard. They're present. It's hard to find the words to describe, but when you listen to it, I think you'll recognize that whether you like the song or not, it is well recorded. And here we go.
I just want to take you from your eyes up in the sky. Let's set this party off right. Players, put your pinky rings up to the moon. Girls, what y'all trying to do? 24 karat magic in the air. Head to toe so clear. Look out. Pop is so.
And there you have that. In addition to having wonderful low bass, the kind of bass that can shake your room if you turn the volume up, everything about it, crisp, clear. The vocal effects in the beginning of the song are just fantastic sounding, really add to the song. It's just a great song. What else can you say? It's well done. Now, another one from a little bit older artist. The big thing about this song to me is that it has a lot of space. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's not a busy song. There's not 100 instruments playing at once. Everybody, when they play, it's more like they're playing it with intent to be heard. And it's what we call a spacious recording. And, Well, basically, check it out. I have a section of it, and then I paused it and skipped ahead a little bit later where things get more dynamic. That's another thing about this song. It has a lot of dynamics, and when I say that, what I mean is there's a big range between low volume and high volume. That makes music much more interesting a lot of times when there's change. If it stays at the same volume all throughout, there is music like that, of course. It tends to get tiring. Maybe you can listen to one or two songs in that style, but after that, you're just kind of tired of hearing it. But if you have change, you have some changes in the song or just the overall volume, the instruments that are playing, it will hold your attention. So let's check this out. Now, just to point out, you've got the finger snaps, you've got this big bass line coming in, you've got a kick drum coming in. They're all getting their turn to play. It just makes it really cool. And now a guitar is coming, and then you're going to hear Ray Charles.
Never knew how much I love you. Never knew how much I care. When you put your arms around me, I get a fever that's so hard to bear. You give me fever when you kiss me, fever when you hold me tight. Fever!
Right there, dynamics. When that drum hit came and then the guitar just kind of slid down the range, that's an example of dynamics. It's just something interesting that you weren't expecting.
In the morning, fever all through the night.
Sun lights up the daytime, moonlight.
Now Natalie.
But when
Now Natalie Cole.
her daddy tried to kill him, she said, "Daddy, Daddy, don't you dare! He gives me fever with his kisses, fever when he holds me tight, fever on his missus. Oh, Daddy, won't you treat him right?"
Now you'll notice there when the horns came in, there were some horns on the left, there were some on the right. The drums were just accenting things. They weren't particularly busy, but every drum hit had a place, and it really accented the song. And of course, Natalie's singing is wonderful. A good example of a very well recorded song, and one that uses space and dynamics to get your attention. Now, the next bit is just a very small clip from The Who, for those of you who know. And when it comes to drum sounds, I really like what their drummer, Keith Moon, does with the toms. Now, if you don't know what the toms are, well, if you pursue this endeavor in becoming a mixing engineer, you will definitely find out, especially if I'm teaching you. Toms are a very important part of drums, and this gives you an example of what I like toms to sound like, especially if the song that we're playing can use that sound. So here we go. You'll hear them. Now that is the sound of toms. Now let's go ahead and talk about some other aspects. I mentioned the playback system before. I'm going to show you some graphs and just discuss the general idea of what we're looking for in a playback system. That will be very important to you when you mix because you're going to rely on it for you to make decisions on how things should sound. So let me put that together and I will be right back. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is the audible spectrum. It is usually represented as a graph. Low frequencies start here, high frequencies end there. So what I'm saying is bass is down here, treble is way up here, and everything else is considered the mid-range, or maybe the low mids and the high mids, or wherever you're trying to draw somebody's attention. Now, this doesn't look like what you would think. Let's say 10-2, that means that it's 100 cycles per second, or 100 hertz. That would be very much a bass frequency. Not so much the sound of a kick drum. A kick drum is usually around 60 hertz, where it pretty much lives. But the bass guitar is going to be playing around 100 quite a bit. And your tone control, your bass control on your radio, stereo, or whatever, typically works around there to increase that range or decrease it, giving you more or less bass. Up here, 10-4, that means 10,000 cycles per second, or 10,000 hertz. That's where that's the beginning of the last octave of music, which goes from 10,000 to 20,000. That is considered the extreme treble that really no particular instruments play up there. No songs are written to start at 10 kilohertz. It pretty much only bats are going to hear it. But the crash cymbals and really all the cymbals on a drum set generate sounds that high, if not higher. If you follow my mouse, I mean, they'll go all the way out to 20,000. Now, the human hearing range at the absolute best goes anywhere from 20 hertz, the very lowest, on out to 20,000 hertz. And that's divided into 10, and it's called 10 octaves of music. Now, realistically, for most people, you can't hear 20 kilohertz. You probably can't hear 18 kilohertz. When you are able to hear that, generally, is when you're a kid, you can hear all of it. You can hear right on up to 20, and maybe you're exceptional and you can hear maybe a little higher than that. But once you get into your 20s, your ears start to fade on the high end. Now, I'm not saying that you go deaf or anything. I'm just saying that, once you hit your 20s, and especially when you get to your 30s, you're on an overall decreasing trend of losing your high frequency hearing gradually. You don't notice it. It's gradual until it gets incredibly bad. But, if you're in your 30s, you might be hearing up to as high as 18 if you're lucky. Later 30s, probably not. Maybe you'll hear up to 17 or 16K. In your 40s, I don't know. If you've taken really good care of your ears and you've never listened to anything loud and you've worn hearing protection around any kind of loud noises, well, maybe you've preserved it. But in general, once you get up into the 50s or 60s, you're going to be pretty much at 10K and a little above. Some people can hear up to 12K, maybe 13K when they're in their 60s, but generally it starts to fade. Now, enough depressing news about hearing. But fortunately, that's the last octave of music. So if you can't hear anything above 10 particularly, you still can hear the other 9. So you can hear most of the music, and that's not really a huge hindrance, not being able to hear way up here. So this graph here demonstrates my next point, which is the speakers that I use for monitoring at church are this model here from JBL, 308 Mark II. This is a test of that speaker where they measured the sound coming out of it, which is a constant tone that sweeps from 20 to 20,000. And it just plays it back. It starts real low, and it goes whoop, all the way up. And they record it with a calibrated microphone, and this is what comes out of the speaker. Any deviation up and down represents a volume change. So let's go over here. That's 1K. That's 2K. Right in the middle, around 1500, there's a dip. And that's literally a drop in volume for that particular frequency, that pitch. If you had some, let's say you had a tuning fork that was tuned to 15K for some crazy reason, it would not be as loud as a tuning fork that was tuned for 1K. As you can see, the volume drops down. This scale here gives you relative volume, 40, 45, 50, and so on up to here. Now, what we're looking for, ideally, loudspeakers are not perfect devices, and there is no perfect one out there. If you have a variation of plus or minus 3 decibels, that's what these represent, 90 decibels. That's a measurement of loudness. 85. So you've got a 5 decibel range from here to here, from here to here. When you look, you'll see that the average is right about here, and the dip is here. Well, that is about 3 dB. It's not particularly noticeable. You could, with a tone control, try to boost that back up so that your speaker is more even. And you might hear the difference, but chances are it's not going to be very noticeable. And for the average person, in fact, for the above average person, listening to this speaker, you are not going to notice that there's a dip at 1500 especially. Because anything that's playing in that range would probably be a vocalist or whatever, and they're certainly not going to hold a note at 1500 hertz. So you're just not going to notice. The same goes for here. There's a rather fairly good peak here at, let's say, 15K. That's at the extreme end of most people's hearing. They're just not going to notice it. Not a big concern. And by the way, this is a multiple measurement graph, so the green line is what we're interested in when you're looking at the speaker straight ahead. So these speakers are what we call pretty flat in response. It's even. This red line represents the ideal. It's a little bit of a slope. This is the way people prefer their music to sound. They want a little bit more bass and a little less treble. And this is considered and agreed upon by most researchers that this is pretty much the ideal response that most people like to hear on a playback speaker. And this speaker pretty much hits the mark. There are some speakers that are better than this, that are more even, but not many. And they cost a lot. So there you are. All right, so here is the matching JBL subwoofer that goes with the LSR 308s that I showed you before. It has you can't see it, but there's a 10-inch woofer underneath. It has an amplifier built into it. And basically what it enables in my setup, it enables me a frequency response range of anywhere from 30 hertz on up to 20,000. Now, 30 hertz, again, extremely low bass, very little music down there, if any. In fact, most of the time when it comes to live sound, no matter how big the subwoofers are, they go as large as 21 inches. That's a really large speaker. They only go down to 40 hertz. And why is that? Well, the lowest note of the bass guitar is about 40 hertz. So anything below that doesn't typically exist in most music that you're going to play. The only exception would be pipe organs in churches, which we hardly see anymore. But when you do, especially when you see a really large one that costs a gazillion dollars, they do go down. In fact, they go below our normal hearing. They go down to 16 hertz for whatever reason. And when you hear one of those notes, you don't actually hear it, you feel it. It's extremely low. And it will go up to 20 hertz, whatever key on the organ, and then you'll start to be able to hear it. But it's not what you would think of as bass most of the time. It's just not, it's more of a feeling more than a sound. 40 hertz, though, and up is very musical. That's what we're used to hearing. The bass guitar gets that low. The kick drum on a drum set will typically be centered around 60 hertz. That, again, is a pretty solid thumping sound. As you go higher, let's say to 100 hertz and whatever, now you're getting into the bass guitar range more typically, and that's what most people consider as bass when they listen to music. Now, here's a mention of headphones. These are the headphones that I use. By no means they are the absolute best on earth, but they are considered very accurate in their playback. They don't emphasize the bass. They don't de-emphasize the bass. The high end is, again, even, and pretty much what we're looking for in that frequency response graph that we saw for the JBL speaker. These headphones are pretty accurate, and when I listen to music on them, and especially when I listen to my own mixes on them, I can pretty much believe what I hear. If the bass is too loud on those headphones, the bass is too loud. So turn it down in your mix. If it's not enough, probably got to turn it up. And in general, that's an accurate headphone to use. It's called an AKG Model K371. Costs about $150, so it's not super expensive. Okay, now we've talked about accurate playback monitoring, whether it be headphones or speakers. The next important thing is the room that you're listening in. You certainly want to treat the walls. You do not want excessive echoes coming from the walls or the ceiling or the floor. The effect it causes for you when you play your music in a very echoey room is that your brain gets confused. You have a sound emanating from your speaker, and it bounces off the wall, and you hear the original sound, the one emanating from the speaker, it's closest to you. And then you hear the reflected sound off the wall a few milliseconds later, and then you hear more reflections coming off the ceiling and the back wall and so on. So it tends to muddy up the sound. Now, you're not too aware of it. You're used to hearing it that way, and that's what you consider normal. But when you're mixing music, one of the chief things we do in music is add reverb to vocals and snare drums and things like that. And if we're already working in an echoey room, we're not going to add, if any, reverb to our recording, because we're going to say, well, it just sounds, pretty good the way it is. Or maybe it's too much echo, but, that's the way it is. So you're going to make the wrong mixing decisions. So you do want to put acoustic panels on your walls. And here is a picture of what that would look like in a typical studio. And here we go. If you follow my mouse there, this particular photo is not showing the speakers. So I guess what they're showing is the wall that you don't see, the wall that's behind this one, is where his speakers are. So he's showing a backwards view. But irrespective, these are what the panels look like here on the ceiling, on the back wall, and on the sides. They're typically 4 inches high. They have inside of them, it's just a wooden frame, an open wooden frame. And inside is a type of fiberglass insulation, a very specific one. It's very dense, and it absorbs sound very well. So you basically put it inside the wooden frame, you put your cloth around it to cover it and hold it in place and make it look nice, and then you attach it where you need to attach it. So these on the back wall obviously are helping to cancel reflections from the back wall. The ones on the sides are really important because where you're sitting, you hear them, your ears are pointed to them. So you need these to cancel side reflections coming out of your speakers hitting the walls. And then, surprisingly, but it works really well, is you need ceiling treatment also above where you're sitting. This is typically called a cloud, I guess because it's above your head. And I certainly have one here, and at church I have one also. You get reflections off the ceiling. You don't tend to think about it, but I remember putting a cloud on the ceiling in my room, thinking that I'm probably wasting my time, but I have the extra material, so what the heck, I'll hang it up. Made quite the difference. I distinctly remember listening to a song by an artist I like, and I had always thought that there was really no reverb on the lady's voice, her singing voice. I just didn't hear it. Well, I put the cloud up there, in addition to all the other panels, and all of a sudden I could hear some reverb on her vocal. I said, oh, that's how they actually recorded it. That's how they mixed it. Isn't that interesting? Well, by getting rid of all these distractions, reflections, echoes coming off the wall, I can hear what's coming out of my speakers now without being distracted by anything else. So I hear the recording very accurately, and it's very enjoyable. And of course, most people who come over to the house and they walk into this room, or at the church, they walk into the media room, they almost always say, it's so quiet in here. Well, that's because when you talk, you're not hearing any reflections off the wall. So it tends to be a very quiet, pleasant place to be. And it's ideal for listening to music and mixing. Okay, here's another example. Here's the guy's studio monitor speakers. Those are Yamahas, and those are what I own at home. That's not saying that they're the best on earth, but for the price, they work very well. I have this picture in here mostly because, again, you can see the forward-facing view of the acoustic panels when you're working with music. You'd be sitting right around here. Your speakers are aimed at your listener right in the middle. And the other thing that there is added to this, which was not in the other picture, is this panel here and this panel here. And it's going diagonally across the corner of the wall. And it goes all the way down to the floor. So it's about 8 feet tall. So you got one here and one there. So those are typically, instead of being 4 inches thick, they're typically 6 inches thick. And that is because we want them to absorb low frequencies. Bass, when it gets reflected all around the room, doesn't sound like an echo to us, but it does make the bass muddy sounding, as you would say. When you put these things across the corners, that's the most common place for a panel like that. It's called a bass trap. It will reduce the bass reflections in the room substantially because it tends to accumulate in the corners. You've got reflections going on one wall and then another one, and it tends to focus on the corners. So putting these up will dramatically improve your bass. Now, it won't make everything perfect, but it will indeed make your speakers more accurate. That's the idea. And when you really want to go to town, you can put bass traps, if you follow my mouse here. You could also put them diagonally across the ceiling, going from here to this wall. The same thing would be over here, because that's a junction of two walls, and that's where bass tends to collect. And you could put one up here if you wanted to, and a pair of these against the wall behind you that we can't see right now in the two corners, and so on. Depends how far you want to go. For most of us, though, this basic setup will give you a pretty accurate working room. It's not perfect, but it definitely works okay, where you can make pretty good decisions on your mix when you use this. Now, after you've gone to the trouble of getting a good set of monitors and probably a subwoofer or maybe good headphones, then going ahead and designing a room that you're going to mix in, and you go ahead and build your own or buy acoustic panels and install them, you're a long ways towards getting a nice sounding room. However, you also will want to use an equalizer, which is basically a fancy tone control that adjusts bass, mid-range, treble. You can boost it or cut it just like on your car radio or wherever, where you have a bass and treble control, or you have an equalizer in there. And here, when you're measuring the frequency response of your speakers in your room, remember the shape of your room, the amount of bare walls and so on will affect what you hear. It'll make some areas louder and some lower, like you see here. And you will have anything but what we call a flat frequency response. So you need to treat the room with acoustic panels and so on to help eliminate a lot of these peaks and valleys. And then you want to use an equalizer and a calibrated microphone and software that emits a tone that starts, in this case, from 30 hertz, the extreme low end, on out. I only went to 15K. I had no need to go out to 20. Can't hear up there anyway. But, I went, so it basically gives you a range. It starts off on a low frequency. You hear it coming out of your speakers, very low, grumble, and then it starts increasing, going up to 40 to 50, 60, and so on. It keeps rising in pitch. Sounds kind of science fiction-y, in fact, when it goes on. And it ends up all the way at the top here, 15K. And your microphone picked up the output of your speakers and graphically represents it. Now, this is what my system looks like in my room at home after equalizing it. In fact, the equalizer I was using saw my measurements and was able to calculate correction factors to make it as even as possible within reason. And this is what I ended up with. In fact, I only told it to make corrections from the lowest to about 600. Anything after that, from here out, I said just leave it alone. And the reason for that is, once you get into the higher frequencies, the wavelength of each sound is very short. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when you turn your head, when you turn your microphone, your measurement microphone, just a little bit, because of the wavelengths being short, the time that it takes for that sound to reach a microphone is actually pretty substantial because they're very short. And you will get a different response. If I had turned the microphone just, a quarter of an inch to the left, all of a sudden this might be louder, this might be lower, and so on. It would look different. And you'd be chasing your tail trying to equalize this because you'd have to lock your head in the vise where you cannot move to equalize it for that listening position, and that just doesn't work. Fortunately for us, our brains are very adaptable, and the fact that, as you turn your head, the level of the various frequencies in here changes a little bit, your brain just compensates and it's fine. Down here in the low end, though, there's usually much more, large dips and boosts and so on that really unbalance the sound. That's very audible. So you want to go at it with acoustic panels and so on and equalization. And in my case, I have one subwoofer under my feet here, pretty much in the middle of where I'm sitting. And then I have another pair to the left and right of me. And because they're placed in different spots in the room, they tend to add and subtract bass frequencies. They even out the room to a large degree. And that's why I'm able to have a rather flat response from 30 to, let's say, 250 hertz. That's considered very flat for a speaker system in a room. Any speaker you might look at, regardless of what it costs, is not likely to look much better than this. That's just physics and how it works. So that's your last step in getting your room set up. You've got good monitoring, good speakers. You've got treatment for your walls that helps to reduce reflection so that you can hear things without distraction. And then you've used an equalizer and a measurement system to measure and correct your response. And now you've got a pretty evenly even sounding listening system. Now the only thing that's left after that is basically to get used to what it sounds like. You might, because of the room you're in and the peaks and nulls that you have in the low frequencies, you might kind of think that a certain amount of bass, a large amount in certain areas, is normal. Well, no, it's not. So what you do is you go ahead and you go on Spotify or what have you, listen to some well-recorded music done by recording engineers that, again, have a very acoustically well-treated studio that they mix their music in, and listen to the songs that you're familiar with. This album here, The Nightfly, is considered an audio standard by sound engineers, live sound engineers. They'll set up their equipment in some venue where they're going to play, and they'll put one of the songs on there because they know what it sounds like, and they know it has a nice range of low to high. And you can dial in your system pretty well by playing one of these. But regardless of the Nightfly or not, use music that you like and listen to it. And you might find that, it doesn't have as much bass as I thought. Well, before you just, grab the bass control, just listen to it a while. Give it a chance. Listen to some other music. You're going to suddenly discover that some recordings are not that well recorded. Maybe they were done 30 years ago when things just weren't as good as it is now. And you'll go from, like here I see The Who, Live at the Hall. Well, this was done in 1970, and it sounds okay, but it doesn't have a lot of bass. Just didn't. Go up here to Bruno Mars, 24K Magic. That has a ton of bass. That's a modern recording. And you might say, boy, my system sounds great with Bruno Mars. Doesn't sound as good with Live at the Hall by The Who. And whoever else you might pick to listen. The point is, give it a chance, get used to what it should sound like within reason, and go from there. And then after giving it a good chance and a good listen, you might say, well, I think I still want to have a little extra bass. And then you can go to your equalizer that you used to correct your speakers and perhaps add a little bit of low end to it if you think you need that to make it sound good. I definitely do that with certain songs. I'll listen to the Nightfly. That doesn't have as good of a low end as the Bruno Mars stuff. And that's because it was recorded back in 1982. And it was primarily done for vinyl records, which do not have as much bass as modern digital music is able to do. So I'll add a little bass if I'm just listening for pleasure to the Nightfly. And then I'll take it off because when I put on Bruno Mars, bass will be way too much. Put it back to the way it's supposed to be. So with that said, we've discussed what kind of interest and attitude you should have towards music in general, the questions that I would ask that would identify to me that you're a potential candidate. You have to be able to tell me what you like about a song, like I did. I played, I think, 5 songs and identified to you what I liked about each song. That gives you an idea of what I'm looking for. You don't have to like the same things I like in the songs, but you do need to tell me that, well, I like to listen to so-and-so because of this, and then they can tell me. That tells me that they're able to identify aspects of the music, that they would be able to, if they were mixing, they would be able to accentuate it and use it to advantage to make the song sound better. Then we talked about equipment, your speakers and monitors and so on, what you need to do to your room to make it sound good, and then to follow it up with a measurement microphone and measuring the response of your speakers in your room, compensating for it with an equalizer or what have you. Usually software will do it for you. And then finally, start listening to music with your newfound system that's considerably accurate, more accurate than anything you've had before, and get used to that. And that's basically it as far as the beginning. Next video, we'll go into some actual mixing of songs, and I'll show you a before and after, what it sounds like in the beginning with no adjustments. And then the final product when the song is when a song is done, and you can hear the difference, and it's pretty night and day. So I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So thank you. Thanks for watching.